Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. This is Frank Henning, and I'm here with Will Medlin. We're from Woodard and Curran, and we're going to run you through some of the updates on field delineation and permitting associated with the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So we'll kick this off and have a good time. Just a slight bit of technical difficulty here. Let's get this going. All right, there we go. So what we're going to be talking about today, of course, is Navigable Waters Protection Rule. But we want to talk about some of the changes to the federal wetlands delineations, and then we also want to talk about some of the interactions that the NWPR can have with state level regulations, and particularly some of the buffer regulations. Then we're also going to take you through some field delineation scenarios and some different permitting scenarios that we've seen as consultants working on wetlands and waters in the state of Georgia. I'm going to turn it over to Will Medlin and let him take you through NWPR.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. I really appreciate the intro. Hey, everybody. We're going to be talking a little bit about the revised definition of waters of the U.S., which is now known as the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. This rule went into effect last June, on June 22nd, 2020. And when the EPA put it out with the Corps of Engineers, they really had a driving idea behind it to increase consistency and predictability when it comes to determinations of what is a water of the United States. They came up with 4 basic categories for jurisdictional waters, which was, down from the numerous categories that had previously been out there. They're really trying to make it a little bit easier. And then they gave us some additional clarification on what waters were excluded from federal jurisdiction. They also provided a definition for a typical year that was a little more regionally appropriate. So next slide, please, sir. So which features are waters of the United States under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule? So there are 4 categories, and the first one there is you see on the slide is traditionally navigable waters, including the territorial seas. These are your large rivers and other tidal water bodies that are within 3 miles of the coastline. Second category is tributaries, and tributaries in this instance refers to intermittent and perennial streams. The third category is a very important one, lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. And there are some exceptions to that. And the fourth one, really important one, which is some of the delineation scenarios and permitting scenarios you'll see later on revolve around our adjacent wetlands. So what's not included? There are actually 12 categories of features that are excluded from jurisdiction under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but in this particular instance, for this presentation, I'm going to sort of focus on some examples of those that are typically excluded because I want them to be relevant and hope that you guys will find some use when considering your project site or your land that you're, the property owner of. So the examples of features that are not waters of the United States are groundwater. Although it's funny, there's a court case going on in Hawaii right now that may change that with respect to whether or not groundwater is a water of the United States. But that right now, under Nav Waters Protection Rule, groundwater is excluded. Ephemeral features, so gullies, rills, non-wetland swales, ephemeral streams, and you'll hear Frank talk a little bit more about those later. Wet weather conveyances is a lot of times what we call them. Certain agricultural and roadside ditches. Ditches are a big, contentious feature when it comes to wetland and water body delineation. So, those have been excluded, all except for certain instances. Artificial lakes and ponds. Water-filled depressions created relative to mining or construction activities. and then waste treatment systems. And I've got two photos there on the side. Oh, just before you go, Frank, sorry. I've got two photos there on the side to the left. One is an example of a industrial wastewater treatment pond up on the upper left, so you guys can kind of see what a waste treatment system might look like. And then the other on the bottom there is a ephemeral draw or wet weather conveyance that would be, typical on a project site. That would be an unregulated feature. Sorry about that, Frank. Next slide. So what is a typical year? The Corps and EPA have provided us with a new definition for typical year, and it's very important when it comes to the periodicity and direction of flooding when you consider WOTUS. So the typical year typically is defined by normal periodic range for precipitation and other climatic variables annually, seasonally, etc. It applies to the specific geographic area in question where you're doing your WOTUS delineation, and it's based on a rolling 30-year period. And so you see there at the bottom, jurisdiction based on inundation by flooding must occur within a typical year. So if you look over on the right-hand side, it's very important to consider whether or not you're in a drought and use the antecedent precipitation tool that you see up there on the upper right-hand corner to be able to determine, are we in a typical year? And you can see as far as the rolling 30-year average, that orange band in the graph there, that's your rolling 30-year period, and the blue is kind of where we are as a snapshot in time. Next slide, please, sir. So when you're thinking about a project site and assessing it, there are a few key points that are important, at least in my perspective, that I want to share with you guys. Number one, wetlands are still wetlands. The definition of wetlands per the Corps of Engineers and EPA has not changed. And so, you still have to have all three parameters for a feature to be a wetland. You still need wetland hydrology, you still need hydric soils, and you still need hydrophytic vegetation. This rule is really about connections. Are lakes or ponds natural or artificial? So, were these lakes, a Carolina Bay, for example, or a Grady Pond, or are you talking about something that was constructed? And where was it constructed? Was it built in an upland? Was it built in an ephemeral feature, for example? The proximity to WOTUS and the proximity to upland areas for artificial ponds are extremely important. Groundwater connectivity does not establish a basis for jurisdiction. Many of you probably remember the post-Rapanos and post-Swank environment of significant nexus when there was ecological connectivity that was sometimes in play for adjacent wetlands, or groundwater connectivity for adjacent wetlands. That's out. It does not establish basis for jurisdiction. Key point here, abutting wetlands are still jurisdictional. So abutting means touching at any point on a side. So if you've got a wetland that directly abuts a WOTUS, a tributary, for example, then it will still be jurisdictional. Key here in terms of the inundation of floodplain wetlands and other adjacent features, wetlands, impoundments, lakes, is what is the inundation frequency and flow direction for those adjacent wetlands and other features? Do they get inundated in a typical year, and is it coming from the WOTUS to the feature rather than surface flow from an adjacent wetland in a floodplain back to a WOTUS? It's very important that you determine flow direction. And then ditches need to be carefully reviewed in the field. There are some very specific criteria for ditches to be considered jurisdictional, and the assessor in the field needs to pay very close attention to those, map them, and then figure out exactly what characteristics are there in the field to determine jurisdiction or support the Corps determining jurisdiction. So a few more best practices for field staff involved in wetland delineation. Mission planning. This is a critical one. It's always good to make sure that you've checked the weather, you've reviewed your site in multiple phases, looking at historical aerials, looking at the soils there, what's the high water table like. It's not always going to be a single bullet sniper mission, as an old supervisor of mine used to tell me, but the more mission planning you can do up front, the better results and the more accuracy you can have when you complete your field work for wetlands and water bodies. Check drought monitoring. That kind of folds into mission planning. Understand, be familiar with, it's always good to have formal training in, but be very familiar with the North Carolina DWQ stream ID procedures for understanding flow regime, whether it's ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial, is very important. If you've got a borderline call of something that's ephemeral, or it might be considered intermittent, it's good to have that quantitative empirical data from that NCDWQ form on hand if a regulator asks you about why you classified a certain feature as, ephemeral. Reviewing natural barriers in the field, understanding natural levees, dunal systems, things like that. If you're down on the coast, it's very important to understand if something's natural or artificial and what the connections are through or around or over that natural barrier. And that leads to hydrologic connectivity. So, when you're in the field, it's very important to collect survey or GPS locations for your culverts and water control structures so that you do understand how things flow within the watershed. Document flow paths and any alterations. Sometimes you'll have an excavator out on site while you're working and digging new ditches and pushing piles around, and it's very important to understand if the hydrology has been altered on your site. And then as you're in the field, it's extremely important, I believe, to continually review the field delineation procedures while you're out there so that you're constantly doing your QA/QC on yourself while you're collecting data.
All right. So flipping back, we're going to talk a little bit about the state level response to the NWPR rules and how the state has responded, or how the 401 water regulations and the water quality certification kind of plays with the NWPR. We're going to talk about those rules and then also talk a little bit about the state mandated buffers. So buffers for warm water streams, trout streams, and then also the coastal marshland areas. So as we look at the 401 certifications and wetlands and waters in Georgia, the boundaries align. So the federal and state jurisdictional boundaries in effect are the same for streams, open waters, and wetlands. So those permitting for those features are going to be identical. So the changes in NWPR are going to be reflected in what's regulated by the state of Georgia. The one area that hasn't changed or didn't change any with these new NWPR regulations is the state mandated buffers. So you still do need to understand how these buffer regulations play out, and along with that, have to understand who is the regulatory authority over those buffers. And if you have a local issuing authority, a local government that has adopted the Georgia rules, then that local issuing authority is responsible for determining those state waters. And if a stream buffer variance is required, that local issuing authority also has to include a letter, or that state buffer variance has to include a letter from the local issuing authority confirming that determination. So they have to confirm that a stream is a stream. But projects not regulated by a local issuing authority, then the Georgia EPD is responsible for determining those state waters. And as far as resources that we commonly use, of course, Georgia has a field guide for determining the presence of state waters, and that's a real useful tool. And then Will mentioned earlier the North Carolina DWQ, that stream identification form that's very useful, especially when you're trying to determine whether the difference between a ephemeral stream, an intermittent stream, and a perennial stream. So a couple of useful tools that we like to use in the field. As far as those state mandated buffers, when you're looking at the inland areas, the non-coastal areas, you've got buffers basically for most streams and open waters. And those buffers are going to be measured horizontally from the point of rested vegetation. So if you look at the image on the top right-hand corner, you see there's little green areas, that's rested vegetation, and the buffers would be measured horizontally from that rested vegetation or the point of rested vegetation. And then, the image below that is a stream, perennial stream, but it has gabion walls along that stream buffer area, right at the point where the vegetation would have been rested. In that case, there's no rested vegetation, and as a result, you'd have no buffers. There are some exclusions, and you can find those in the Georgia Erosion and Sedimentation Act. So it does help to read through that act and understand what those exclusions are. As far as your state mandated buffers in the coastal areas, it's a little bit different. When you're trying to delineate those coastal marshland buffers, it's measured horizontally from what they call the coastal marshland upland interface, and that's determined and basically promulgated in the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act. So you have to know where that marshland interface is, and it would be measured the buffer would be measured 25 feet horizontally from that interface. So some of the other points that really deserve consideration that take a little bit of thought sometimes are when we're thinking about state buffers, especially for trout streams. You're looking at a non-trout stream, or basically a warm water stream, or an area in the marsh. We talked about that 25-foot buffer, and those, for streams, those buffers are applied to either perennial or intermittent streams. They're not applied to ephemeral drainages. So only perennial and intermittent streams, if they're warm water streams, are buffered. And then, of course, we talked about the marshland having that 25-foot buffer. When you get over to the trout streams, you first have to understand, what streams are trout streams. Where are the trout streams located? And there's a list of the watersheds and stream segments that are considered trout waters, and those are maintained by the Georgia EPD. And if you're working in an area where you have trout waters, then perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams all get buffered. And the one other thing that you do have to consider, which was mentioned earlier, is that those streams also have to have rested vegetation. So if you did have an ephemeral drainage or an ephemeral stream that was in a trout water area, but it was well vegetated, there was no rested vegetation, then that stream would not be buffered. So just some really kind of things that you need to think about a little bit when you're considering the regulations for these resources. So in addition to the state, one other thing that we really wanted to focus on in this presentation was, how do some of these regulations play out at the local level, and what are the local issuing authorities or the local governments doing, and how can they play a part in regulating these features? And when you think about the local issuing authority, we already talked about how that local issuing authority plays a part in the determination of stream resources, but they also can have their own buffer ordinances. There are certain items that were excluded from the Georgia Erosion and Sediment Control Act, the items that they're allowed to be more stringent, under ordinance, they're allowed to be more stringent than the state on. And one of those things is stream buffers. So they can have stream buffers that are larger than what's required by the state, and then they can also require stream buffers for features that don't have rested vegetation. So for instance, if there was a wall or a feature, a stream that did not, for whatever reason, had a retaining wall or some other, protection, maybe there were stones or something like that along that stream, the local government could still require a local buffer. And if they require buffering at that local level, then the local government is also required to manage the variances associated with that buffer or the buffers that they own. So the state still owns their buffers, and then the local government owns the buffers that go beyond the state regulations. And so in addition to stream buffers, there's some other ordinances that local governments can enact and be more stringent on than the state. And those are things like wetland buffers, floodplain buffers, tree ordinances, and even the size of a project when it comes to disturbance. So they can require permitting for much smaller projects than the state might otherwise require. So all, again, things to consider when you're looking to permit these resources. And so, Will, I think I'll pass it back to you for examples of some examples on wetlands and waters.
Sure. Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate it. And it looks like we're getting close on time, so I'll try to be efficient here as we go through these. So this is a northern Georgia site up in the northwest part of the state. And it was a large, development site where there were several different WOTUS resources delineated. And as you can see there's a long stream that flows in from the east and then sort of flows west-northwest, joining up with a larger tributary, which eventually flows into the Coosa River. And, we know that by evaluating the watershed. But when you look at these wetlands and other waters that were delineated on this example project site, you want to consider them under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule and decide, okay, are these features adjacent or are they abutting? And how would they be regulated? So if you're looking at the large stream that flows through most of the site, that would be a tributary, and thus it would be jurisdictional. As it flows through the culvert there at the northern end of the site and into the larger stream is also jurisdictional because it's a tributary providing flow to a traditional navigable water. But when you consider the wetlands that are delineated across this site, even though each of them, like wetland 5, for example, they're in different locations, each of them touch the water body, the WOTUS. They are abutting. So if you look at wetland 5, it's actually a large linear floodplain wetland that cinches up pretty good at the edge of the cleared area. And it almost is like a wetland ditch / slough that flows north and provides hydrologic input into the creek there. But the important thing to remember is that all of these wetlands abut. And so therefore they would be jurisdictional as adjacent wetlands, category 4, under Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The open waters there that you see on the eastern side of the site, those are excavated ponds, and those excavated ponds were dug in uplands, and they were not dug within a water of the U.S. previously. So based on their artificial nature and the fact that they were excavated in an upland area or in a non-jurisdictional or unregulated area, those would not be considered jurisdictional under the Nav Waters Protection Rule. Oh, Frank, did you want to talk about ephemerals on that side, or?
Yeah, we can touch base on ephemerals real quick. So yeah, so if you had some ephemerals that were draining into, say, one of these streams, say stream 2, for instance, if ephemeral was draining into a stream, and that stream was considered to be trout waters, it was a trout stream, so ephemeral waters that drain into into a trout stream, so located in an area that's considered trout waters, if there's rested vegetation along the banks of that ephemeral, if the vegetation is rested, then that would require buffering. So not only would the stream itself require buffering, again, a 50-foot buffer, but the ephemeral would also require buffering. So even though the ephemeral itself would not be regulated, the buffer would.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Good call there. So this is a Middle Georgia site along the Ocmulgee River, and this project was done under the recent Nav Waters Protection Rule criteria. Under those regulations, it was done post June 22nd, 2020. And as you can see, there's the river to the northeast, and then you've got this linear feature that sort of parallels the river that is running from northwest to southeast. That's a large levee or an artificial dike. And there are not any culverts that create flow paths between the Ocmulgee River and this particular site. However, in reviewing the site, there were 3 parameter wetlands that were delineated in this particular piece of property. They had wetland soil, they had hydrology, and they had hydrophytic vegetation. And you can see that they're isolated around the different areas of the property. There was one small culvert on the southern side of the site providing flow from the wetland to the south area, the wooded area, to the south of the railroad there. But the important thing with this site is that the traditional navigable water, or the WOTUS resource that was nearby, did not provide any flow to inundate these wetlands within a typical year. These wetlands were inundated primarily by precipitation and possibly by elevated groundwater, and stormwater runoff, but they were not hydrologically connected via a WOTUS in a typical year, and thus these wetlands that are neighboring a TNW and neighboring other WOTUS resources would be unregulated and would not be considered waters of the U.S., or they'd be considered non-jurisdictional under the Nav Waters Protection Rule. So this is an example 404 permitting scenario. So a highway widening project that needs to impact a roadside ditch that drains only uplands and only flows in response to rainfall. So is a permit required for this particular scenario under the Nav Waters Protection Rule? The answer is no. Well, first off, the feature, the ephemeral feature, is not a water of the United States under Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and therefore no 404 permit should be required for impacting this feature with the roadway widening project.
And again, if that was an ephemeral, we'd have to consider where it is. Is it in an area where it could be trout waters? And then, is the vegetation considered rested if you wanted to think about the buffers for a feature, such as that?
Right. So this is another example for a 404 permitting scenario. And as Frank mentioned on the previous slide, there are absolutely considerations for 401 and buffers as well. So I don't want to just draw all the attention to 404, but so this is a landfill needs to expand into a low-lying area with a small intermittent stream and some forested seepage wetlands that do not directly abut the stream. And let's just say, for example, these seepage wetlands only provide flow via groundwater to the stream, but they aren't inundated in a typical year by the stream. Are the features jurisdictional under Nav Waters Protection Rule? The stream would be, but the adjacent wetlands would not be. They would not be WOTUS because they wouldn't be inundated within a typical year by the WOTUS, and therefore a 404 permit would be needed for filling the small intermittent stream, but the impacts to the forested seepage wetlands would not need a permit and would not need a mitigation. Another scenario that could potentially come up in the Piedmont, but more likely in the coastal plain, a commercial development project needs to impact an isolated wetland about 125 feet away from a perennial stream, i.e. a tributary that flows to the Savannah River. If that feature is isolated and there's no flow from the tributary that inundates that isolated or quote unquote adjacent wetland in a typical year, then the answer would be that the feature is not a WOTUS, number one, so it's unregulated under Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and a 404 permit and any associated compensatory mitigation would not be required for filling said isolated wetland. So a couple of key concepts and just bringing it all together. I think we've gone a little long here, but just to sum it up one more time, ephemeral drainages and streams are not waters of the United States. Unconnected and isolated wetlands and water bodies are not WOTUS unless it can be determined that they're inundated by a traditional navigable water or other WOTUS in a typical year. There's no longer any case-by-case significant nexus analysis as was previously required under the Rapanos decision. The Nav Waters Protection Rule may likely reduce the scope of jurisdiction for waters and wetlands around the United States. I think that we're going to enter a period where there may be some swing back now that we're under the Biden administration, but that remains to be seen exactly how all of the litigation will play out. I do understand that Colorado has stayed the rule and is the only of the 50 states to do so far, at least based on my most recent understanding. It's important, as Frank talked about, to remember State 401 water quality certification during your permitting process. And that's not just in Georgia, but if you're working in other states, oftentimes the 401 water quality certification plays a critical role in the 404 approval process. So it's like brother and sister. You have to consider both of them. And some final conclusions and discussion surrounding the new rule and some food for thought for landowners and developers alike. If you're planning to work on a site and do some development, land disturbing activity, then it's highly recommendable to have that site assessed for waters of the United States and wetlands by a professional environmental consultant. Wetland and stream delineators absolutely need to understand and apply the right definitions during field work. Understand hydrologic connectivity by locating those culverts, pipes, flumes, and other channels that may convey flow. Use and incorporate the antecedent precipitation tool and drought monitoring to determine if your work was conducted during a typical year. That is something that the APT is oftentimes required for an approved jurisdictional determination with under the Savannah District's current protocols now. So familiarizing yourself with the APT is a good idea. And always avoid impacts to waters of the United States where practicable. Work with your engineering design team and the construction team to figure out ways to creatively implement your project while minimizing environmental impact. And stay out of wetlands and streams. Don't place stormwater management features in tributaries. Otherwise, they're going to be jurisdictional in the future.
And with that, we're wrapping things up. We really appreciate everyone's attendance, and we look forward to our Q&A session with our panelists coming up. We have a representative from Georgia EPD, Michael Berry, and then we also have Corey Rayburn from the city of Atlanta to talk about the local ordinances. So thank you very much for your participation, and please reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.